The sun had not yet risen over the snowy woods. The sky was still dark, and everything outside the small wooden cabin was silent. Elias, a middle-aged human man with tired eyes, was just putting another log in the fireplace when he heard a knock. It was soft, hesitant, and almost lost in the wind. He stood still, listening again. Another knock, a little louder this time. No one ever came this far. Not unless they were lost or running. Slowly, Elias opened the door. Standing there was an alien woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She was shivering badly, clutching a small child close to her chest. Her clothes were torn and thin, not made for cold nights like this. The child looked worse, barely breathing. Lips blew from the freezing wind. Elias stared at them in shock, unsure what to say. "I offer myself," the woman whispered, her voice shaking from cold and fear. "Just one night with me, and food for my daughter, please." Elias blinked, stunned. He had heard stories of alien women, refugees from the war zones, wandering. Broken worlds like this one. Many were taken, traded, used. But this was the first time one had knocked on his door. He looked at her closely, the desperation in her eyes, the way her arms trembled while trying to keep her child warm. She wasn't lying. She was at the edge of collapse. Elias didn't say a word. Instead, he stepped aside and opened the door wider. The woman hesitated, clearly not expecting this. She looked up at him, confused, then slowly stepped inside. Warm air from the fire wrapped around her like a blanket. Elias closed the door and locked it, then quietly pointed to the rug near the fire. "Sit there," he said, his voice calm and quiet. She moved fast, almost falling to her knees as she laid her daughter down near the fire. The child whimpered, curling into her mother's arms. Elias walked to the kitchen corner and poured hot broth into a small wooden bowl. He handed it to the woman, who fed her daughter first without eating a single drop herself. "You didn't ask for anything," she said after a while, staring at the flames. "Why?" Elias didn't answer at first, just sat on a wooden chair nearby, watching the fire. "I don't take what's offered out of fear," he finally said. "You didn't want to offer yourself. You were just trying to survive." The woman blinked, as if no one had ever said such words to her before. "My name is Nira," she said softly. Elias nodded, not giving his name just yet. That night passed in silence. Nira wrapped her arms around her daughter, trying to keep her warm. Elias gave them blankets, a pillow, and stayed in his chair, eyes half closed, but never sleeping. He kept watch. Not just for danger, but for them. They were strangers, but he already felt responsible. At one point, Nira opened her eyes and saw Elias adding more wood to the fire. She wanted to ask him again, what did he want from her? But she was too tired, too broken to understand this kind of kindness. So she just closed her eyes again and held her daughter tighter. In her dreams, she remembered the cold camp they had escaped, the guards, the hunger, the pain, and now, in this small, quiet home, for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Not because she was hidden, but because someone had said no to her offer, and yes to her as a person. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin, the fire burned gently. Elias sat by the window with a rifle resting beside him, just in case. He had lived alone for years, building this life of silence. But tonight, everything had changed, not because of a bargain, but because of a knock and the look in a mother's eyes when she begged not for herself, but for her child. The first rays of sunlight touched the frost-covered window. Inside the wooden cabin, it was quiet, except for the soft crackling of fire. Nira slowly opened her eyes, still wrapped in the blanket Elias had given her. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw the sleeping form of her daughter beside her, breathing gently, her little face calm. Nira blinked, her heart beating faster. Her child was alive, warm and safe. She sat up carefully, brushing her daughter's hair from her eyes. No coughing, no shivers, no blue lips. Tears filled Nira's eyes, and she whispered something in her own language, a small prayer of thanks. The room smelled like cooked meat and something sweet. She turned and saw Elias near the stove, flipping something out a pan. He wore a thick sweater and looked focused. He hadn't said a single word since that night, and yet his actions spoke louder than any voice. Nira stood, her legs shaking a little, and walked slowly toward him. Before she could speak, he turned and held out a plate. 2 slices of bread with melted cheese, some fruit, and a cup of warm milk. For her, he said simply, nodding toward the child. Nira took it with both hands, stunned. She expected cold leftovers, or maybe nothing at all. But this looked like care, like effort, like something meant for someone important. She walked back to her daughter and gently woke her. "Little star," she whispered, "wake up, there's food." The child stirred, yawned, and slowly opened her large eyes. When she saw the plate, her mouth dropped slightly. It had been too long since she'd seen real food. Nira helped her sit up and fed her small bites, holding the cup to her lips. And then it happened. The little girl smiled. A small, innocent, toothy smile that lit up her tired face. Nira froze, the spoon in her hand trembling. She couldn't remember the last time her daughter had smiled like that. Elias, standing in the corner, saw it too. For a moment, his cold, tired eyes softened. He didn't say anything, but he gave a short nod, then turned back to cleaning the stove. Nira looked at him, confused again. Why wasn't he demanding anything? She had offered her body, her silence, her obedience, anything to save her child. But this man, this human, just gave without asking. As the morning passed, Nira cleaned the dishes without being told. She folded the blankets, wiped the floor, and tried to make herself useful. She couldn't sit and just accept. She had to do something in return. Later, Elias brought in chopped wood from outside, his breath showing in the cold air. Nira opened the door for him and helped stack the logs near the fireplace. "You don't have to," he said. "I want to." She replied simply. They didn't talk much, but something began to shift between them. Not friendship, not yet, but maybe understanding. Nira was used to cruel men, guards with sticks, merchants with sharp smiles. But Elias had silence and kindness like armor. That afternoon, Elias went into a back room and returned with a box. Inside were old clothes, some too big, some clearly once meant for a child. He placed them near Nira and nodded. "These were my daughters," he said, his voice lower than before. "You can take what fits." Nira touched the clothes carefully, her fingers shaking. "Thank you," she whispered. She wanted to ask more about his daughter, his past, but she stayed silent. That night, after her daughter fell asleep in fresh clothes under thick blankets, Nira sat near the fire and watched Elias fix a loose hinge on the door. He moved with quiet strength, like a man who had fixed everything except his own broken heart. "Why are you helping us?" she finally asked, her voice barely louder than the fire. Elias didn't look at her, just kept working. "Because someone should," he replied after a moment. "That's not a real answer," she said, smiling faintly. "It's the only one I have," he replied. Nira looked down, her hands twisting nervously. She still didn't know if she could trust him fully. But her daughter had smiled today, had laughed softly while hugging the stuffed toy from the box. That had to mean something. Before sleeping, Nira whispered into the fire, "Maybe this is a dream." But the warmth on her skin, the soft breathing of her daughter, and the quiet strength of the man across the room told her it was real. Not a deal, not a trade, but something beginning, something she didn't yet have a name for. The sun had barely set, but the wind was already howling through the woods. Elias added more logs to the fire while Nira tucked her daughter into bed. The girl was finally sleeping peacefully, hugging the soft toy she'd received the day before. The small cabin was quiet, calm, warm, but Nira's heart was not. She stood by the window, her eyes locked on the darkness outside. Every sound made her jump. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. Elias noticed her fear, but said nothing. He simply cleaned his old hunting rifle, checking the chamber and wiping the barrel. "You're expecting trouble," Nira said, her voice tight. "I always do," Elias answered without looking up. Nira stepped closer, her voice lowering. "There are men," she whispered. "They hunt survivors like me, especially ones with children." Elias paused, then set the rifle down slowly. "They followed you here?" he asked, calm but serious. I don't know," Nira replied. "But I saw a mark near the river, a symbol, one they use." Elias got up and walked toward the door. "Stay inside," he said firmly, and disappeared into the cold night. Nira stared at the door after it closed, fear bubbling up inside her. She sat down near the fire, wrapping herself in the blanket Elias had given her. She tried to stay strong, but her hands trembled. Half an hour later, the door opened again. Elias stepped inside, his boots covered in snow, his eyes darker than before. "They're close," he said. "3, maybe 4 of them, hiding in the trees." Nira's breath caught in her throat. "They killed my mate," she whispered. "They took our food, our fire, they laughed while doing it." Her voice broke, and she covered her face, trying not to cry too loud, not to wake her child. Elias stood still for a moment, then moved to the back of the room. He opened a hidden trapdoor under a rug and pulled out more weapons: an old shotgun, 2 energy knives, and a pulse flare. "I've lived alone for years," he said, "but I've never turned away someone who needed shelter." Nira looked up, wiping her eyes. "You're going to fight them?" she asked in disbelief. "I'll scare them off," Elias replied. "They're cowards when they're not holding the power." She wanted to stop him, wanted to say it wasn't worth it, but she couldn't. No one had ever stood between her and danger before. No one had chosen her side that night. While her daughter slept soundly, Nira stayed awake by the window, watching Elias move through the shadows outside. He circled the cabin, placed traps, hung silent motion sensors, and waited behind the tree line. The moon was full, lighting the forest with a pale glow, and then came the voices, low and cruel. "They said a pretty alien girl ran this way," one of them sneered. "She's probably warm now with some old human," another laughed. Nira's heart pounded as she crouched near the window, unable to breathe. Suddenly, a flash of blue light burst from the trees. Elias had triggered the pulse flare. It blinded the intruders, lighting up the night like lightning. Then a voice roared from the dark, "Leave now, or I start counting bodies." The men shouted in panic, stumbling, tripping over wires Elias had set. One fired a shot blindly, but it hit a tree. Then came the unmistakable sound of Elias's shotgun, not aimed to kill, just to warn, to control. It worked. The men fled, slipping over snow and roots, their laughter gone, replaced with fear. Elias returned an hour later, silent, his face expressionless. Nira opened the door for him, eyes wide with emotion. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. "I did," he replied, wiping his boots. "You risked your life for us." "No," Elias said, looking at her for the first time with eyes full of something deeper. "I gave it meaning." She didn't know what to say, so she just stood there, tears rolling down her cheeks. He handed her a small device, a motion alarm. "Keep it with you when I'm not here," he said. "It will warn you." She nodded, clutching it tightly. That night, she slept beside her daughter with the alarm in one hand and Elias's quiet courage in her heart. For the first time since her world was destroyed, she didn't feel hunted. She felt protected. She didn't know what Elias truly felt or what this strange bond between them meant, but she knew this. No bargain, no trade, no deal had ever given her this feeling. And it all began the moment she knocked on a stranger's door, looking for food, but finding something far more powerful. A protector who didn't ask for her body, only her trust. Days passed slowly after the night of the attack. The snow melted a little as spring crept into the woods, but the chill in the air still lingered, like a memory that refused to fade. Elias repaired the broken fence, checked the traps, and said little. Mira helped where she could, tending to the garden bed behind the cabin, cleaning dishes, watching over her daughter. There was peace, yes, but also silence. A heavy silence, not of anger, but of secrets. Nira had questions she never dared ask. About Elias's past, about why he had chosen to live alone, far away from the cities, far away from other humans. One evening, after the little girl fell, asleep with her head in Nira's lap, Elias sat near the fire sharpening a blade. The sound of metal sliding across stone echoed softly in the room. Nira watched him for a long time before speaking. "She smiled again today," she said gently. "Twice." Elias didn't look up, but he paused. "Good," he said. Nira smiled, but her eyes carried sadness. "She hasn't smiled since her father died." She whispered, "I didn't think she ever would again." Still, Elias said nothing more. The fire cracked, shadows dancing on the wooden walls. Nira hesitated, then asked the question she'd held back for too long. "Why are you really here, Elias?" He stopped sharpening the blade, finally lifting his eyes. "You know my name," he said quietly. "You told me a few days ago," she replied. "I didn't forget." Elias looked at the fire for a long moment, then took a deep breath. "I used to live in the cities," he said, his voice rough like old stone. "Had a wife, a daughter, a job I hated, but a life that worked." Nira didn't move, just listened. "Then came the war," he continued, "the one between your kind and mine." Nira lowered her eyes, guilt rising like a wave. "My wife got sick during the food shortage," Elias said. "I couldn't get medicine in time. They were rationing it for soldiers." Nira looked up, her throat tight. "And your daughter?" she asked softly. "She starved," he whispered. "One morning I woke up and she was just gone." Nira covered her mouth, trying not to cry out. Elias looked away, his face hard but tired. "I left after that," he said. "I didn't want to see people anymore. Didn't want to see governments pretending to help, or neighbors pretending to care." Nira didn't speak, because what words could fill such silence? She simply reached out and placed her hand gently over his. Elias flinched, not used to touch, but he didn't pull away. They sat like that for several long moments, the fire warming their faces, the past between them finally shared. "I'm sorry," Nira said. "For everything. You didn't start the war," Elias replied. "And you didn't deserve what it cost you either." Nira felt something shift in her chest, something deep and quiet, not pity, not fear, but understanding. They were both survivors of different battles, carrying scars that didn't always show on skin. The next morning, things were different. Elias offered her a cup of tea instead of just setting it on the table. Nira cooked breakfast instead of just cleaning up after him. They ate together, slowly, while her daughter played with wooden blocks near the fireplace. Laughter returned, soft at first, like a breeze but real. That afternoon, Elias brought out an old toolbox. "This cabin's not much," he said, "but maybe we can make it better." Nira helped him fix a broken shelf, paint the windows, and clear the overgrown path to the well. As they worked side by side, she noticed things she hadn't before. The way he focused when using his hands, the small smile he hid when her daughter ran up to show him her drawing. He wasn't just a protector. He was becoming something else that evening. Nira found herself humming a lullaby from her homeworld while brushing her daughter's hair. Elias listened from across the room, his eyes softer now. "What's that song?" he asked, surprising her. "A promise," she said, smiling. "A mother's promise to protect her child, no matter what." Elias nodded, slowly. He understood it without needing a translation, and for the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy, it was peaceful. It was a space where healing had begun, where two broken lives were being rebuilt. Not through grand gestures, but through small moments, shared pain and quiet hope. Nira still didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. The man who once lived in silence was now speaking, and every word he shared was a step closer to something neither of them dared hope for a home. The cabin stood peacefully at the edge of the forest. The snow had melted, flowers were starting to bloom, and birds had returned to sing in the trees. Inside, Nira was teaching her daughter how to draw with coal on scraps of wood. The little girl giggled every time the lines came out crooked. Elias watched from the doorway, holding a steaming cup of tea, a rare smile on his face. For a few weeks, life had been quiet, safe, warm. It almost felt normal. But peace never lasted long in a world still scarred by war. And that morning, the sky brought a different kind of sound. A low, humming vibration, unnatural, metallic. Elias stepped outside, his smile vanishing as he looked up. A small government patrol ship hovered above the clearing, its lights flashing red and blue. Nira saw it through the window and froze. Her daughter reached for her hand, sensing the fear rising in her mother's chest. Elias grabbed his coat, eyes already calculating. "They found us," he said calmly. Nira's voice cracked. "What do we do?" "Stay calm," Elias replied. "And don't say anything unless they speak to you." The ship landed slowly in the clearing, its engines blowing dirt and grass into the air. Two uniformed officers stepped out, one human male and one tall alien female with a stern face. Both wore the badge of the Border Protection Unit, and both looked ready for trouble. Elias met them halfway, his shoulders straight, his eyes sharp. "Morning," he said, pretending nothing was wrong. "This is private land. We received a report of unauthorized alien life forms." The human officer said, "We need to confirm the identities of everyone living here." "I'm the only one living here," Elias replied. The alien officer raised an eyebrow. "Your house shows signs of recent occupancy. I've been cleaning." Elias said simply. The officers exchanged a look, then moved past him toward the cabin. Nira stepped outside slowly, holding her daughter tightly in her arms. The child buried her face in Nira's neck, frightened by the uniforms. "There they are," the alien officer said sharply. Nira's heart pounded. She stepped back, but Elias quickly moved between them. "They're my family," he said. The male officer frowned. "You didn't report a bonded mate or child." "Didn't know I had to." Elias replied coldly, "I don't answer to the registry." "Sir, that's illegal," the officer said. "You could face charges for hiding undocumented refugees." "I'm not hiding anyone," Elias said, voice steady. "My mate and child are with me by choice. And this land is mine." The alien officer stepped forward, scanning Nira with a small device. "She doesn't match any local records." She said she wouldn't. Elias snapped. "She's from Kiral 9. Her camp was destroyed, everyone scattered. And I found her on the edge of death." Nira watched Elias speak, shocked at how firmly he defended her. He sounded like someone who had done this before. And maybe, she thought he had. The officers didn't back off. "Unless you have legal bonding documents." The male officer said, "She and the child must be taken into custody." Elias reached into his coat slowly and pulled out a data pad. He handed it over without a word. The officers checked the screen, frowning. "Bonding certificate, refugee protection clause, emergency adoption papers, everything legal, all signed and sealed. Where did you get these?" The alien officer asked, suspicious. "I know people," Elias replied. "People who still owe me favors." The officer stared at him for a long moment. Finally, the male officer handed the datapad back. "You're on thin ice, sir," he said. "You better keep them inside and out of trouble." "Trust me," Elias replied. "They're safer with me than with anyone else." Without another word, the officers returned to their ship and took off. The sound of the engines faded into the distance. Nira's legs gave out as soon as they were gone. She dropped to her knees, still clutching her child, tears running down her cheeks. Elias knelt beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "For now, you lied for us," she whispered. "I didn't lie," Elias replied. "I told the truth. Just gave it the right paperwork." Nira laughed through her tears. "I don't understand you," she said, "but I'm grateful." That night, The cabin felt more like a home than ever before. Nira cooked stew with Elias. Her daughter helped set the table. They sat together, sharing food, smiles, and stories. Elias spoke more now. Told them about the garden he wanted to build. Nira shared stories from her planet, songs from her childhood, and when the little girl fell asleep, Nira leaned back and looked at Elias. "You didn't just save us today," she said. "You gave us a name, a place, and something I never thought we'd have again." "What's that?" Elias asked, his voice soft. "Hope," she replied, and in that quiet cabin, where two worlds had once collided, a new family had taken root, not by blood or law, but by choice. The days grew longer, and the cold winds softened into warm breezes. Spring arrived gently in the woods, bringing color back to the land. Wildflowers bloomed near the edges of Elias's cabin. Bees buzzed lazily, and green leaves replaced the old, brittle ones. But inside the cabin, something deeper had started to grow. Something stronger than seasons, something harder to break. A family. Nira now moved through the home like she had always belonged. She didn't ask permission anymore. She just did what needed to be done. Elias never stopped her, and he no longer watched her with caution. He trusted her, just like she trusted him. The little girl, once quiet and afraid, now laughed freely. She played in the garden while Elias tilled the soil, planting seeds with care. Sometimes she rode on his shoulders, pretending he was a giant beast from her mother's old bedtime stories, and Elias, the man who once lived in silence, would chuckle softly, not loud, but enough for Nira to hear. They shared meals at the wooden table, worked side by side, and fixed the broken parts of the cabin together. It was no longer just Elias's home. It was theirs. Word began to spread, quietly, among those who had nowhere to go. A whisper in the forests, across the villages, that there was a place where a human had taken in a refugee, and didn't just offer safety, but belonging. It started with one, a young alien boy who appeared at the cabin door, shivering and starved. Elias didn't ask questions. He opened the door like he had for Nira. Then came a widow with a burned arm. Then a pair of twins who hadn't spoken since the last raid on their camp. Nira helped each one, fed them, listened to them, wrapped their wounds. She became their heart. And Elias, their shield. He taught them how to plant, how to build, how to hunt without leaving traces. He fixed what was broken, both in tools and in people. One night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Elias sat outside on the wooden steps, looking up at the stars. Nira joined him, wrapping herself in a thin blanket. For a while, they sat in silence, only the sounds of crickets and wind filling the air. "You've changed," Nira said gently. Elias didn't look at her, just nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said. "You used to hide from the world," she continued. "Now you're building one." He looked at her then, his eyes softer. "I was waiting for something," he said, "but I didn't know what." Nira reached out and took his hand. Her touch wasn't cold anymore. It was steady, real. "You found us," she whispered. "No," Elias said. "You found me." In the months that followed, the cabin grew. More rooms were added, a rainwater system was built, and a small greenhouse rose near the garden. Everyone helped. Everyone gave what little they could. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was purpose. The little girl, now stronger and full of laughter, began calling Elias something new, not sir or human. She called him Papa. The first time she said it, Elias froze, his hands midair as he carved wood. Nira saw the tears in his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. That night, he sat beside the girl's bed until she fell asleep. Then he quietly whispered, "Thank you." Nira, watching from the hallway, felt her heart swell. She had offered herself in a moment of despair, but Elias had given them everything. He hadn't just saved her daughter. He had given her a father, a home, and a future. Not everything was easy. There were still nights when someone screamed in their sleep, still fears that lingered in dark corners. But the fire in the cabin always burned, and no one ever faced their fear alone again. One evening, as they shared stew with the newest arrivals, One of the refugees asked Elias a question. "Why did you take us all in?" Elias looked around the table, his eyes resting on Nira, then her daughter, then the small group of survivors who now smiled like family. "I lived a long time without reason," he said, "but now I have one." They all fell quiet, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. In that moment, the fire crackled louder, the stars outside seemed brighter, and the old cabin felt alive, forged not in brick or stone, but in kindness, choice, and the courage to let love return. And somewhere deep in his chest, Elias knew he hadn't just built a home, he had found one too. The morning sun painted the cabin in soft gold, birds chirped in the trees, and the air smelled like wet earth and wildflowers. Nira stood at the wooden railing outside, watching her daughter play with the other children in the grass. Laughter filled the space that once knew only silence. She held a mug of warm tea in her hands, her shawl wrapped gently around her shoulders. It had been many months since she first knocked on Elias's door, cold, afraid, and desperate. Back then, she had offered herself for one night, just to feed her child. Now, she was part of something she never imagined, a family, a home, a future. Elias stepped beside her quietly, as he always did. He wore his old coat, patched in places by Nira's careful stitching, in one hand. He held a basket of fresh vegetables from the garden, in the other, a small wooden carving, a gift he had made for the little girl's birthday. "She's growing fast," Elias said, watching the girl run barefoot through the flowers. Nira smiled, her eyes warm. "She doesn't flinch anymore," she whispered. "She laughs now, sings in her sleep." Elias nodded, his voice soft. "She's safe." They stood there together, no need for more words. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of trust, memories, shared moments, quiet love that had grown without being spoken. Nira turned to Elias, her voice gentle. "I never asked for this," she said. "Not this kindness, this peace." "I know," Elias replied. "But you didn't have to." Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything they had carried, the pain, the loss, the fear, melted away. What remained was something pure, something earned slowly with each day. Later that evening, the entire group gathered around the fire pit. They were more than just refugees now. They were builders, planters, protectors of one another. Children danced, elders shared stories, and songs from many worlds echoed through the trees. Nira sat beside Elias, her daughter curled in her lap, half asleep. Someone handed her a bowl of stew. Another offered Elias a drink. They were surrounded by warmth, not just from the fire, but from the people who had chosen to stay. As the stars came out, Elias stood up and cleared his throat. The talking faded. Everyone turned to him with quiet respect. "I never planned for any of this," he began. "I built this place to be alone, to hide from the world." He paused, looking around at the faces that now filled his once empty land. "But then a knock came at my door," he continued, "and instead of darkness, it brought light." His eyes rested on Nira. "I was given a second chance," he said, "and I want all of you to have one too." Cheers rose around the fire, soft at first, then stronger. People clapped, laughed, cried. Some hugged. Others just looked up at the stars and smiled. That night, when everyone had gone to bed, Nira stepped outside again. The fire was almost out, only embers glowing now. Elias was there, fixing one of the benches that had cracked under too much celebration. She sat beside him, quiet at first. Then she reached out and gently touched his hand. "Do you still miss her?" she asked. "My daughter?" he said softly. "Every day," Nira nodded, her voice low. "Me too." They didn't speak for a while, letting the silence carry the weight of their losses. Then Elias looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time, he asked the question that had sat in his heart for weeks. "Do you want to stay, Nira?" She smiled, tears forming in her eyes. "I already have," she whispered. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a small necklace, simple, handmade, with a tiny carved symbol. He placed it gently in her hand. "I made this," he said. "Not as payment, not as thanks, but because I want you to have it." Nira looked at it, then at him. She didn't need to say anything more. She slipped the necklace around her neck and leaned her head on his shoulder. In that moment, under the stars, next to the glowing embers, nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the pain, not the war or the laws of distant planets. What they had now was more than survival, more than comfort. It was a bond, strong and silent, forged not in bargains, but in love. A mother had once begged for one night and food for her child. But the man had given her a home, a name, a place where she could finally breathe. And in return, she had given him what he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to live. Together, they had built something rare in a broken galaxy. Not perfect, not easy, but real, a family.